So, today we're going to be talking about one of the most controversial experiments of the mid-20th century, Stanley Milgram's behavioral study on obedience. So, Stanley Milgram was born in 1933 in New York, and only lived to the age of 51. He actually died of a heart attack, interestingly enough, his experiment considered. He got his PhD in social psych from Harvard, right here in Massachusetts, and actually eventually got a professorship at Yale. He was of Jewish descent, which will actually be very important later on, as it did actually have quite a profound effect on his career and influences on the experiment itself. Additionally, if you wanted some interesting additional material to kind of get a bit of more information, there is actually a very interesting film you can find on Netflix called The Experimenter, and actually goes over the history and more personal life issues of Stanley Milgram and how it really took shape in the behavioral study on obedience. So, as I said, he was born and raised in New York City. His parents were actually Eastern European immigrants, so he is a first-generation American in terms of when he was born, as his parents were Romanian and Hungarian. They were rooted up and moved because during the early 30s there was the rise of German nationalism as a result of the Nazi Party starting to climb to power and gaining a lot of influence in Europe. So many people who were of the Jewish faith began moving westward to places like the United States, and Milgram's parents were no different. So when Milgram was growing up, he showed a very big fascination with the Holocaust and an identification with its victims. He wanted to understand why people would do that, why people would hurt and harm and torture on such a large scale. And this is really what eventually would prompt him to start this experiment, his behavioral study on obedience in '61. So Milgram actually had a bachelor's degree in political science, interestingly enough. He didn't end up getting into psychology until he attempted to apply to a graduate program at Harvard. And he didn't get in the first time either. He was actually rejected because of his lack of psychological background. But eventually, after a couple of application cycles, he did manage to get in, and he actually got his PhD in '61. 1961 was a very busy year for him because in the same year that he received his PhD, he also got his professorship at Yale, and he also began his behavioral experiment, which we would come to know as the behavioral study of obedience. So 1961 was a busy year for Milgram. So a little more background. After World War II, after the Axis powers had been defeated in Europe, there were a number of German politicians and Nazi officers that hadn't been killed in the fighting, and those who won the war thought it fair to try them for their crimes, for what they had done in the Holocaust and during the duration of the war. So these trials actually took place over the course of around a year. So they started in November of 1945, and they finished up around the end of 1946. So those who were being tried were mostly German politicians and Nazi officers, those who were a part of the SS and other such organizations, although some officers did manage to flee Europe, and that's something we'll get to. So the most famous among them is a gentleman by the name of Adolf Ekman, and he was found in the same year that Milgram gave his experiment, or started his experiment rather. He had fled to South America, but was eventually found by Israeli intelligence services. And during his trial, he gave a very famous speech that involved, well, we were just following orders. And that was kind of the sparking point for the behavioral study of obedience, because Milgram wanted to understand how someone could follow this ideology, and is this ideology something that generalizes to other people? So then we come to the actual experiment. So the experiment was multifaceted. It had several components to it. First off, there was a Confederate as a part of the study, a person who was helping the experimenters do what they were going to do. In this case, the confederate was someone known as the learner, whereas the participants were the teacher. And in this experiment, the teacher, the participant, had to list off a number of words, and the learner, the experimenter's confederate, would have to repeat them or receive an electric shock. Now, in reality, the learner wasn't actually receiving any electric shock. The experimenters were actually just trying to see how far these individuals would go. So, eventually, the learner in the other room would have responses that were going to be wrong no matter what. And many of the participants questioned the experimenter as to whether or not they should continue because there were recordings of pain and yells and asking to be let out. And when they would look back, the experimenter would simply reply, "The experiment must continue," or "Please continue, it is essential." And there were very interesting results that followed this. After an individual was told to continue the experiment, the result shows that 65% of participants continued to the highest voltage, that's 450 volts. 65% continued all the way to the end, even after the learner recording stopped. Whereas the other 35% all went to at least 300 volts, which was most of the way. And these are very high voltages, which can be lethal in many cases. So the original experiment that I was just talking about actually only had a male sample. 40 males, working ages 20 to 50. And many of the reasons they gave is that they viewed the experimenter as an authority figure. Because originally they didn't understand why they went as far as they did, and the more they talked about it, the more they referred to how the experimenter was an authority figure and how the way that they were presenting themselves, they thought that they were doing this for the good of science or something else along those lines. They actually went on, Milgram and his experimenters went on to replicate this 18 different times, and they found that these results were generalizable to both sexes. And in order to control confounds, they actually did it in a number of different locations, and the results were generally the same. So this is infamous because of its lack of ethical control. Participants who went all the way expressed a lot of regret, and some had even thought that they killed the learner, because eventually they would reveal the learner was okay in order to give the participants a little more peace of mind. A lot of them actually did experience mental health issues for a long time to come, years, the rest of their life. A lot of these symptoms classifying under stress or anxiety disorders, which is why they were offered full therapeutic services at no cost on the dime of Yale. And interestingly enough, these effects were not made public until 1974, almost 15 years after, 13 years after, actually. But interestingly enough, despite these effects, 80% of the subjects reported they were glad to have participated, and even more than that thought that more experiments like this should be performed for the good of science. So, Milgram didn't only do that experiment. He didn't only do the behavioral study on obedience. He had several other studies which were not as famous due to the lack of ethical issues with them. One of them was the small world phenomenon, where an individual was asked to try and mail a package to an unfamiliar individual with no address, using only people that the subject knew. Now, in most cases, the letter or package they sent never actually made it to the individual in question. Sometimes it did, but interestingly enough, the one result that they found was that it wasn't the individual itself that mattered in forwarding the package, but the geographical features that the individual was in. So if they were geographical features that were necessarily closer to where they thought their destination was, or one that would have favorable increases in the amount of time, or decreases in the amount of time, rather, it would take the package to get there. A second experiment that he helped participate in and plan was the lost letters experiment, where they would place odd letters on the streets, and individuals who found them were seeing if they would mail them or not. And these letters were labeled with good organizations such as government organizations like the CDC or the World Health Organization, and organizations of ill repute like the KKK. And they found that generally these people would send the good letters and kind of just discard the bad ones. So, as I said before, the behavioral study on obedience has had a lot of effects on the field of psychology, and it's really one of the big bases behind modern experimental ethics. It actually resulted and a complete revision of the federal ethical codes on experimentation and research, and it's actually why we have the IRB internal review board system we have now at research bodies and universities. And another big thing too is Milgram's experiment, because of this, cannot be ethically replicated today, or at least not in the exact way that it was performed way back when he was doing it in the early 60s. Not only that, but Milgram had a huge impact on personality and social psych too. So originally, personality psych focuses more on internal mechanisms, how your personality traits affect you on the inside. Now, this was not flowing well at the time because of behavioral standards for psychology, because the behavioral discipline of psychology does not attune well to internal mechanisms, but Milgram's study on obedience allowed personality psychologists to begin exploring personality-environmental interactions, which basically state how does your personality interact with the environment and vice versa, instead of just restricting it to internal mechanisms. It really helped talk about how individuals interact with those situations, such as in the obedience experiment. How does your personality affect your reaction to the environment? And people are a part of that environment, which can really affect your ability to obey or not obey someone. This is also where the cognitive affective system theory of personality comes in. That's CAPS, not something I'll get into because it's not completely relevant to this PowerPoint, but nonetheless, Milgram did have a hand in its influence. One of the other things that people will recognize usually is Zimbardo's prison experiment, and while it does have some shaky research methods to it, it's still infamous, and Zimbardo wanted to very much build on Milgram's study of obedience to see what people would do in situations where given certain amounts of power. One big thing is that before Milgram, psychological experiments were mostly restricted to laboratory settings. High experimental control, but because of that, they didn't have very high ecological validity, which is generalizability to natural settings. Would this happen in the real world? So because of this, it actually allowed a lot of social psychologists to begin focusing more on that ecological validity, because social psych relies heavily on ecological validity, because you can't really have a controlled social experiment in the regard of it being natural. It's an oxymoron, a paradox. So in this way, it actually allowed social psychologists to begin pursuing that ecological validity a little bit more, and allowed them to generalize to larger groups of people. And that is a very long list of influences by Milgram, and the important part to take out of it is that Milgram's largest influences really lie in the domains of social psych and ethics.